This third session deals with how the Bible critiques itself, the counter-witness that is to violence. And we begin with the 8th century prophet Hosea's critique of violence. Now, superpowers and so-called terrorist organisations, who are very often driven by zealous ideals and the need for violence and counter-violence, often perceive their violence as sacred charge and responsibility. Violence itself can often be shrouded by mystique. Those who gave the Bible its final shape very intentionally began with a critique of violence associated with the divine and human. And so the creation poem of Genesis 1, written to subvert the Babylonian myth of Marduk creating not only creation itself, but humankind from violence. The poem of Genesis 1 subverts and critiques the very mystique of violence. The prophet Hosea makes one of the most devastating critiques in all of the Bible of violence. He indicts the northern kingdom of Israel, and we need to start that one.
Yeah, you got it in mind.
I got
That's
into
okay.
your sorry about that.
It's all right. It's all right, because I didn't get quick enough on that one anyway.
No, that's okay.
Do we take it from the top?
Yeah,
Right.
that's okay.
So I was too keen to get the 10 to 5 train.
I was looking at my watch thinking, it might be possible if you really wanted to. But,
No,
No,
keep going.
yeah.
I'd rather
Okay.
get, yeah.
okay. 3, 2.
The title of session 3 is The Bible Critiques Itself, the Counter-Witness. And we begin by looking at Hosea, the 8th century prophet, and his critique of violence. Superpowers and so-called terrorist organisations, who are often driven by zealous ideals and the need for violence and counter-violence, very often perceive their violence as some kind of sacred charge and responsibility. Violence itself becomes shrouded by mystique. Now, those who gave the Bible its final shape very intentionally began with a critique of violence associated with the divine and human. And so the creation poem of Genesis 1, written in Babylon to counter the Babylonian myth of Marduk, bringing about creation and of humans from violence, the poem subverts and critiques the very mystique of violence itself.
One of the things that disturbed Hosea was the way in which community leaders put their faith in violence, and by associating it with religion, gave violence a kind of mystique or a religious legitimacy. The prophet Hosea makes a devastating critique of the mystique of violence. He indicts the northern kingdom of Israel because of a broken covenant. The covenant relationship was at the heart of the relationship between God and Israel. And for Hosea, the use of violence was a breaking of this covenant relationship. At the heart of covenant breakdown, then, is the practice and dependency on violence. The consequence is buying into the mystique of violence and the undoing of creation, that is, the reversal of Genesis. Hosea reflects on the creation poem of God, bringing creation about in the sense of bringing order out of chaos. But now, violence puts all this into reverse and produces social and environmental chaos. Hosea is also concerned with the relationship between the violent mystique and social disintegration. Trusting in chariots and warriors reduces the state to moral decay and social collapse. Violence destroys community and the values that make for a holistic, integrated community.
Hosea believed that the sacred violence of his own society was being underpinned by zealous myths, and that these need to be repudiated. And so Elisha, who is an important figure in Israel's story, the father of Hebrew prophecy as it were, turned faith into zealous idolatry by giving his support to a massive and violent political purge by King Jehu. But even Elisha, important as he is, does not escape Hosea's critique.
Hosea recognized that the mystique of violence at the heart of social culture leads to the popularization of crime and brutality. People become brutalized and do acts of violence. Violence brutalizes those who practice it. It dehumanizes them. It destroys moral standards and moral authority, and produces crime and total disregard for any law and order. The mystique of violence for Hosea causes perversion of justice. It drives society into corrupt practices. People become snared or trapped in the cruel treatment of others. Violence itself becomes a great act of injustice against society. Violence then undermines respect for law and order. Violence is corrosive and destructive. The leaders in Hosea's society had fallen in love with violence and threatened those with violence who dared critique or question its mystique.
We turn now to look at the book of Revelation as a counter to imperial violence. Read literally, as many do read the book, read literally though, the book of Revelation is a book with frightening political and military implications. And there are millions of people who are claiming a Christianity and who want to see the violence of the book of Revelation somehow fulfilled. But the author of the book, by using violent imagery and citing the values of imperialism, may well be subverting the same empire, turning it on its head, and alternatively pointing to the act of non-violence of Jesus, who is the central person in the book. Beyond the literalistic reading, and one might say the simplistic reading, and the violent projections of perhaps many fearful and insecure people, there may be something much more radical and much more subtle going on in this text.
We begin to see the subtlety of the text in Revelation when we pay attention to the imagery used. This imagery is rooted in the Roman imperial world. The Roman Empire both celebrated and worshipped the goddess Victory, or Nike. After Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 70 CE, coins were minted showing Nike setting up a trophy over a prostrate Jew. To the flying goddess Nike, John opposes a flying angel. The empire's message of victory through crushing defeat and violence is not Revelation's eternal gospel or good news. Chapter 14 also contrasts the lamb and the beast, one non-violent and the other violent. The purpose of the book is to lift up the vision of Jesus as counter-message to the empire's theology of victory or Nike.
The Lamb, who is a central figure to the book of Revelation, is an imagery which John uses and on which he draws on the non-violent image of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53. This is the essence and the heart of the book of Revelation's message. In chapter 12, verse 11, the faithful have conquered by the blood of the Lamb. That is an image of violence being overcome, not by violence, but by suffering love, or being overcome by the power of vulnerable, non-violent love. And so the Lamb
who was slain or whose blood was shed by the violence of the empire is the radical symbol of suffering non-violent love. Revelation also uses the word conquer up to 16 times, which is more than half its usage in the Christian Testament. The Greek word is Nikon, the same as the Greek goddess of victory and war. John has God's people conquering not by war and violence, but by other radically different means. The book of Revelation is setting out an alternative value system of non-violent resistance. The beasts of chapters 11 and 13 make war and conquer and kill. The in-between chapter 12 has God's people conquer by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. What this means is that the way of the Lamb is non-violent, vulnerable, suffering love, and testimony is violence to that non-violent power, even to the point of giving up life.
Those who read the book of Revelation, and there are millions of such in our world, and who read it as pointing to the last great cataclysmic war as God's way of realizing the kingdom, have in fact misread and distorted and abused the text. Reading the book of Revelation as some kind of divinely inspired basis for brutality, war, violence and bloodletting is a serious heresy, and perhaps the most serious and damaging heresy of all. It is dangerous, and it is heretical fantasy. In a violent world where violence threatens to destroy and overwhelm, and where too often it is legitimized by religion and by God, what is required is a much more ethical and critical reading of biblical texts. Not everything that we read is the word of the Lord. Still less can we make the liturgical response, thanks be to God. But perhaps we can take something from the New Zealand Anglican prayer book, where readings end with the words, "Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church." Only if we read texts in context and read them critically and ethically can we perhaps hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.